This is Permissionless Liberty.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Knott, and I'm joined by Daniel Sanchez. And today we're going to be discussing some ideas surrounding libertarianism. Just a quick, brief explanation of libertarianism. In general, a libertarian is someone who envisions a reduced role for government and a expanded role for individuals, individual autonomy. From a libertarian perspective, society is structured in a way that they dissent from or disagree with. And in general, society prefers a larger role for government and essentially an ever-expanding role where government takes on more and more responsibility and the individual has less and less responsibility. So the challenge of libertarian social philosophy, at least at the moment and for last several decades, going back into the 1900s, is what to do about that. Libertarians have to decide, what they're going to do about society evolving in a way that's not something that they agree with. So there are many different ways of approaching that problem. And the range of options that we have define different schools of libertarianism. Today, we're going to be discussing essentially how ideas influence the course of events, how public opinion and the ideology of the public relates to our politics or our political structure. So, Daniel, if I got us started, so if there's anything you can add to that or alter that, and then I'd like to get started on discussing an idea whose time has come.
Sure. Yeah, that's an article that I wrote a while back. And it starts by talking about this Ron Paul speech that he delivered in 2008. It was during his presidential campaign during the at the same time as the Republican convention. So they had a counter convention called the Rally for the Republic. And there's this one moment where the crowd really roared. And it's when he said, "An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government." And that is paraphrasing a Victor Hugo quote, but Thomas Paine wrote something similar when he wrote, "An army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. Neither the Channel nor the Rhine will arrest its progress. It will march on the horizon of the world and it will conquer." Now, that is a very lofty idea that ideas can conquer armies and governments and empires. And not everybody believes that or agrees with that, of course. Mao Zedong, the dictator of China, the first revolutionary dictator, he has this quote where he says, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." And so my essay was trying to discern who was right. Was it Thomas Paine and Ron Paul, or was it Mao? And I first off, I'd like to ask you, Adam, who do you think was right?
Uh, I think Ron Paul was right, and I can give you a great example of that because um, uh, maybe you would agree with this, but when socialism was first introduced in the 1800s and for decades afterwards, I think that from the point of view of socialism and those who advocate a greater role for government, they believed that that was an idea whose time has come. And they were animated by this idea that history was unfolding in a certain direction. I think the historicism, I don't know if Hegel was a historicist, but the idea that history has a certain prophesiable or predictable set of stages that it goes through. And I believe that the socialists were animated by this idea that coming after the Industrial Revolution, which was a time that idea had come, that now it was their turn and this idea had come and nothing was going to stop that, not armies, not governments. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that the idea that's animating the certainty or the motivation that one gets from believing that they're on the side of history, that they're with the historical times, that they're involved in some important movement that is unfolding towards a beautiful future, is very, very powerful. And so I agree that the idea, an idea that's time has come, is a very powerful force. And I think you can see that in history. Again, I'm not a historian, but I think if you look back in history and just even if you have just a very modest grasp of history, you can see certain ideas that were animating certain time periods. So I definitely believe that's very important.
I agree too. Thomas Paine was not only saying that in general, but he was referring to something that was happening that he was part of making happen, because he wrote The Rights of Man, Common Sense, these hugely influential pamphlets that basically changed the minds of so many readers and contributed to this revolutionary ferment that was going on with the American Revolution. And that was very much idea based. It was, there's this great book called America's Revolutionary Mind by Bradley Thompson. And he shows, by going through the documentary evidence of the revolutionary period, that so like letters to the editor and articles, and letters, correspondence, and that the revolutionary generation, they were steeped in the philosophy and the ideas of liberty. That it wasn't just this like, oh well, you know, someone did something that we don't like, and so we're going to, overthrow the king or separate from the king. It wasn't just, oh, we don't like that, or we're going to follow these other promising leaders because they seem better. It was more principled than that. And it was more ideological, especially through the influence of John Locke, because like the documentary evidence shows that the founding generation were hardcore Lockeans. Like either they would be citing Locke or paraphrasing Locke. And Thompson makes the claim that the American revolutionaries were just as much Lockeans as the Bolshevik revolutionaries were Marxians.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's how much of a sway that the ideas of Locke had over them. So it was very much an idea, like the ideas of liberty, the ideas of classical liberalism, because John Locke's ideas were basically the foundation of what became known as classical liberalism. But then it was fast forward to Mao's time, and what led up to Mao was that the idea whose time has come of that time were the ideas of socialism, the ideas of Marx especially. And that's ultimately what swept Mao into power. It wasn't just the barrel of a gun. Ideas are what determine whose hands the barrels of the gun are in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ideas what the public's what the ideas they're working with determines what they're willing to accept, and determines the goals that they set, that they think that society should be aiming for. And if those goals entail sacrifice on their behalf, they've already agreed to the goals. And so if we as observers may say, well, how can they do that? But if they have accepted the premise, and the ends that are expressed in these ideas, and then somebody says, well, if you agree with me, well, then here's your part that you have to play. So when you look at a communist society, you're saying, well, why don't they revolt? I think what we're discussing here today is that they have probably not all of them, but a lot of them have accepted the premise of the society they're in, that whether think people should be equal materially, or the idea of a collective, and the idea of the individualism is something that's not to be something bad. So if they accept those ideas, then they are willing to accept the consequences or the societal structure that their superiors intellectually tell them it is necessary to have that. Because even if you look at Cuba, even, and I know there's a lot of geopolitics going on that's responsible also for their poor state, but you would think that so why does the society accept that and not revolt? But it's because most likely because they've accepted the goals of their philosophers as worthy goals, and so they're willing to sacrifice for them.
Yeah. And to your point about sacrifice, I mean, famously, the end of the Declaration of Independence, it says something along the lines of, we signatories of the Declaration of Independence pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And those are no empty words, because, some of those signatories died or were imprisoned. And
They had good lives. Some of them were wealthy merchants. When they said those words, they meant, we know the risk we're taking, and we willingly take this risk. So it was a very, very, very valiant gesture that they made.
right. And they were taking those risks, like what they said they were taking risks about in the end of the Declaration of Independence were the principles at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Because what's remarkable about this document is that it's not just a political document just saying that we are now seceding from our overlords. It opens with a philosophical justification. Just we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator by certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Uh, and they, based on that, very Lockean, because everything in that preamble could be traced directly to Locke. Based on that, they argued that they were right and justified in declaring independence. And so it was all philosophically grounded, and they were willing to sacrifice for this ideal. And it wasn't just them, like the people. It wasn't just the leaders who were willing to sacrifice, the people who fit into that room where they signed it. It was the public were willing to follow their lead, and to stand up for their rights, and to resist the invasion, and to enforce their separation. They weren't all. A lot of them, a surprisingly large amount of them were very literate Lockeans, but they weren't all. But they either were or they respected the leadership and of those who did. And I think that's also what what happened um, in the Bolshevik Revolution and in the communist revolutions in general. That not everyone um, you know wa- was schooled in Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, but the leaders were, and they were convincing enough to motivate their troops, and the ideology of the masses, even if it wasn't like completely Marxian in all of its nuances, like it was basically like in favor of state control. Like even before there were like the czars, they weren't as dictatorial as the later communist rulers, but there was fertile ground for that. They wouldn't have been able to lord it over the American populace, no matter how many guns they had.
Yeah, I think in what we're talking about, to me, I always go back to that there's two opposed forces. And I think sometimes this gets jumbled in our discourse, that we think there are a multitude of alternatives in politics. And I don't see it that way. I see, we're talking about the Bolsheviks versus our own founding fathers, and they're diametrically opposed. One is fighting for the idea of individual freedom so that the individual can pursue happiness. And one is the idea of a collective where the individual, individualism is frowned upon, and the individual should not rise above his interests, cannot be supersede those of the collective. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that there are certain aspects of our conscious life that that lead to the two poles. And so the idea, unfortunately for us in our team, our libertarian team, the idea of individual happiness and individual autonomy being the driving force is certainly in decline. We're involved in a struggle to try to maintain and eventually one day maybe expand that, or to reanimate that that ideal and that motivation. But that's our challenge. But the world in general has already, in a sense, bought into the idea of of government-run society. And the problem that we have is that, and the problem with when we formed our country a few hundred years ago, is that once you adm- as- once you agree to the principle that the government should be used to provide some sort of service or some sort of good, and there's a range from good or service number 100 to 1 to 1 million, then logically there are smart people in the world, and they're going to say, well, if you can do the one thing, why can't we do this other one? So if we need a government for protection, why can't we have it for national defense? We can have it for national defense. Why can't we have it for national adjudication? So what happens is, once you have agreed to the principle that government can produce, should provide a good or a service, you have now basically agreed to a principle that other smart people will then hold you to account and say, well, you've already agreed that we can do this, and I have something I would like to add to the list. And so if you do that for 200 years, guess where you end up? You end up where we end up, right where we are right now, with with banking and insurance and education and the recent attempts to regulate speech, the recent attempts to regulate our own individual medical choices. And so the idea that we are trying to reanimate, the odds aren't good. Now, I don't think it's a numbers game, so I'm not intimidated by the fact that the odds aren't good numerically. But any betting person or anybody who wanted to pick winners would definitely not side with us, because public opinion firmly believes in government provision of goods and services. And I'll just give you two quick examples, and then I'll turn it back to you. When I discovered that that public opinion, the extent to which I was at odds with it, I was just discussing with a good friend. He's a very good person, and I was trying to make the point is, how far have we gone when the government is subsidizing, soccer fields for middle class families, like let's say a community soccer field is part of a community college, and they're getting all sorts of money to build a very expensive soccer field with rubber pellets and all this, and it's very expensive. And my friend took issue, said, no, I want that. I want that soccer field. That was an eye opener to me, because it, it lets you see the extent of the challenge. Another one was, this happened very recently. I think I mentioned it when we were talking previously, but tell me if you've heard this one. But one of our congressmen or senators floated the idea or proposed a bill that would begin to sell federally held land back to American citizens. As a libertarian, I think that's a great idea, because the federal government owns a ton of land. And the most strident objectors I saw to that were conservatives, and they were objecting on the grounds that they wanted to maintain our public parks, which, on the face of it sounds, maintain our public parks. But from a libertarian perspective, that means government-run parks, government-controlled parks is what they were arguing for. So that just those two examples, you can see, and these are our next door neighbors, these are our relatives, these are our very close friends who have these beliefs. So we're obviously living in a time that is not a libertarian time in history. And so the challenge for us is to somehow rekindle an idea that's going against the grain of what all of our contemporaries believe. And so with that, I will turn it back to you and see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so there's this other quote by Ludwig von Mises where he says, "The struggle for freedom is ultimately not resistance to autocrats or oligarchs, but resistance to the despotism of public opinion." So, yeah. And so, fortunately, though, public opinion is not static. It's not a constant, that it is a variable, and it can be changed, because public opinion is ultimately dependent on the prevailing ideology, and that ideology can change. Um, so, a big part of why the American Revolution happened, and why, in general, sort of like that, the move towards liberty that was part of happened, going back to when Locke was actually writing, like during the right before the Glorious Revolution, and then Great Britain's move to liberalism, the Dutch Republic's move to liberalism, and then the American Revolution, and then much of Europe liberalized, and and then because of that, we had just the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of capitalism, and living standards skyrocketed. Ultimately, those were the fruits of the ideological seeds planted by people like John Locke and Adam Smith. That they wrote books, and those books were really influential, not necessarily to, like, all the masses, not to, obviously, to the illiterate people, but it was influential among the public-minded thought leaders of the time.
Among the learned.
And and then that swayed public opinion in that medium of liberal public opinion. Politicians found it advantageous to cater to that, and so that they liberalized trade, and they liberalized, you know, they respected freedoms more. And but then, you know, ideologies changed again. That, you know, Karl Marx twisted some of the mistakes that Adam Smith and David Ricardo made, and he wrote stuff that swayed a lot of intellectuals, and then other statists joined the choir, and so but it could change back again. And so that's why Mises dedicated his life to trying to shift the ideology of the public. He said that the flowering of human society depends on two factors: the intellectual power of outstanding men to conceive sound social and economic theories, and the ability of these or other men to make these ideologies palatable to the majority.
Well, I, I understand the sentiment, and the challenge that I think we face with what Mises is saying there is that there are some certain structural realities. For example, I think you and I probably both agree that even with the institution of voting, you know, it's perfectly legal within a democracy to promise the assets of one person to another to obtain a vote. It's perfectly legal. It's also perfectly legal to lie in the political process. So, you know, I think as libertarians have had a hard time in that atmosphere where we're in a democracy where it's structured a certain way, so it incentivizes opportunistic politicians to appeal to the public with certain promises, and that promising essentially goods and services, whether it's Social Security, whether it's healthcare, whether it's jobs, etc., and then use that to expand its own powers. The What I wanted to say was, you know, going back to the revolution, you know, of course, it, when things get very, in other words, if the public gets really angry because things are really bad, of course, then risk taking becomes relatively less risky because you have less to lose. So my thinking on libertarian social theory has always been, well, let's not wait until things are so bad that we have a whole bunch of angry citizens that want to throw off the government. Why don't we, while things are relatively safe, find a way to create the liberties that we're going after while we still have a civilization and certain legal protections, that so that maybe we could fight for liberty in relative safety, relatively speaking. Because of course we know that if the government becomes super oppressive, that the people will revolt eventually, and because they'll have, you know, they'll be destitute. But I think our challenge as libertarians is to not wait for that time, but to use this time that we have now, where we still have legal protections, For example, our talk today, or protest or civil disobedience or whatever it may be, and not wait until, because the founding fathers were, if I'm not mistaken, the king and the English government was becoming oppressive or becoming very aggressive. And so I could be wrong on that. Um,
Yeah,
the
it was reversing a long period of what they call benign neglect, where they were just kind of pursuing sort of a laissez-faire policy towards the colonies. Um, although even though they were being, more tyrannical, like it pales into comparison of the kind of tyranny that Americans today tolerate. And so to your point that, you know, they didn't wait until, the king of Great Britain, got so tyrannical that it really impoverished all the colonies, so that they were desperate, and so that they, you know, couldn't use their freedoms to spread the ideas of liberty and to resist the tyranny that, they kind of nipped it in the bud.
mhm. The idea is we see where this is going. So we know that if nothing's done, it's inevitable what this result is going to be. So we can either wait until that inevitability, or we can start now and uh, and start to take action now. When we say the idea has come, and when Mises speaks about it, I of course I read that as him expressing that the idea to convince the public at large, to animate them to assent to change their philosophy. But there's another way we could think about it, which was to, um, and we've discussed this, in you and I have discussed this, but the idea could be an idea whose time has come for libertarians. In other words, uh, for example, and I think an idea that's time has come is for libertarians to start an incipient or nascent libertarian society by whatever means that they uh, uh, devise, and that is an idea whose time has come. And but that's not speaking to animating society in general. It's speaking to really, um, the libertarian movement and the idea of, um, trying to convince libertarians that, maybe looking at our history and what's been tried up until now, and a frank discussion or assessment of that, and then maybe, based on that knowledge, agree that a new direction should be charted, or a new conception should be adopted. So when I think of an idea whose time has come, or an idea that could animate, I personally think of it in terms of animating those who are already struggling to try to achieve a libertarian, an ideal for individual freedom, and speaking to them more so than trying to convince larger society, to adopt our libertarian philosophy.
Yeah, and I think Leonard Reed would resonate with that as well, because there's like biblical quotes that are relevant to this, like cast not your pearls before swine, um, or the parable of the sower, where, like, just cast your seed, and some will fall on stony ground, and some will fall on fertile ground. And then also the, like, shake the dust off your sandals if you're not received by, any person that you're trying to share the gospel with. And all these messages are related to the notion of what Leonard Reed believed in, is that you can't impose your wisdom on someone else. That the the best you can do is improve your own understanding and share your understanding with people who are in the market for it. And if your understanding expressed through your speech and writing is really good, then it will attract an audience of people who are ready to hear that. Um, and so that's why Leonard Reed really didn't go for, propaganda and, you know, brainwashing and, yeah, trying to use, you know, marketing methods and advertising methods to try to like sneak your ideas into people's heads, um, that he really believed in, sharing with people who are ready for that. And at first, that's going to be a very small group. It's going to be
Mhm.
what Albert J. Knott called the remnant. Um, but if that remnant grows and grows solidly, like not just having like a superficial understanding of liberty, but having like a thorough grounding in it. Like that's, I think, one of the big differences between our generation and the founding fathers, is that like we have this big libertarian community, but I would say that, you know, the average libertarian American doesn't know the basics of his philosophy as well as the founders did, like the founders who were steeped in Locke.
Mhm.
Like at most they've just read enough to like kind of change teams and to like be a fan of the Liberty brand, but they're not actually students of the Liberty philosophy.
Mhm. Well, what I'd like to add to that is that sometimes we can argue about a, a course of action to someone and to little or no effect. But if we take action ourselves and are successful, somebody may be induced to replicate us out of self-interest. So I know I use this example, a number of times, but when Satoshi Nakamoto, uh, the anonymous inventor of Bitcoin, released uh, his code, um, what led to all of the cryptocurrencies, the copycats, was that he demonstrated how it could be done. And so then self-interest just took over, because now every coder wanted to be a founder of a new cryptocurrency. And so you could see that if Satoshi had argued, presented, let's say, a seminar on what he thought the ideas of the future of what a future cryptocurrency could be to, let's say, a broad audience, that they might say, well, maybe you're right, but they wouldn't have the incentive to invent that. But once he showed how it was done, then in short order, his actions were replicated, and they were replicated out of the self-interest of everybody who wanted to then um, build a similar product. So I feel that with libertarianism, if we were successful, if any success were had in actually um, forming some sort of liberty, actual political liberty movement, and I don't mean idea movement, but actually one that had a concrete existence, that could potentially attract people to replicate it. But I think I'm going a little bit off on a tangent here from the idea. But the ideas can replicate from repetition, not only from communication of them in abstract terms, I guess is how I'd say it.
Yeah, I think it's like, there's the theory and then there's the praxis. And the praxis can be, a very powerful argument. And I think there's a um, parallel for that with American history too, because the American experiment became the American miracle. And then that's what Leonard Reed called it. And then that became the city on the hill. That became the wonder of the world, the model of the world. And pretty soon, countries across the world were trying to copy our revolution with their own constitutions and their own bills of rights and their own similarly structured governments. Unfortunately, with state-based solutions to liberty, power corrupts. And so even if an experiment starts with the best intentions, because of the corruption of power, the whole thing can be led astray. And that's what you're seeing now with what started as a very liberty oriented experiment, now is doing things like, the lockdowns and global empire.
Yeah, I think Ayn Rand wrote that at one point that she admired the Declaration of Independence greatly in the beginning of the United States, and she mentioned that even at the beginning there were seeds of its decline. And I don't actually know what she meant to that, but to me it would mean just that once you establish, as I mentioned earlier, once you establish that that you agree to the principle of government services, it's hard to now stop the next one that's argued for by very intelligent and very powerful people. And so if you continue to add that, and I also think regarding corruption that it's not a coincidence that the bigger government gets, that the more we see that there's corruption. I think it's actually just a natural correlation that um, we're going to experience that growth of government in a negative way, and we can use different terms to describe it. But when the decisions are constantly taken away from you, and your freedom to decide is constantly shrinking, and the another government is continually growing, that we can call it corruption, we can call it immorality, there's all sorts of things, but it's just they're all downstream of the concrete fact that you are being allowed to do less and less, and you're being told what to do more and more, and you're going to experience that as a negative experience. So you can attach different words to it, and you can see. You could try to figure out why all the machinations of the people who are involved in doing that to you and all that. But it's really just, if we just analyze it, it's all downstream of just the simple fact that the realm of government's growing, the realm of individuality, individual action is shrinking. So that's the primary challenge: how to combat that in an age where the animating idea or ideology wants that to continue. Whether they do explicitly, which is an ideologically driven increase in government by those who actually want that and want that endpoint, the communist endpoint, or whether it's inadvertent, whether somebody just with good intentions wants a law enacted for what seem like good reasons, but isn't thinking about, well, this is the 10,000th law, and there's no repealing of the previous 9,999. And that's not their concern. So they're whether it's inadvertent or whether it's ideologically driven, our challenge as libertarians is how to conceive and how to enact a libertarian society in some form when our fellow citizens, who are good people, most of them, don't want to do what we want to do. Again, it's our neighbors, it's our relatives, it's our parents, it's our children. They are in a different place. They see things differently. So this whole tide is moving in one direction. And we are trying to, through the exchange of ideas, light a fire somehow. And we're trying to bring into being an idea whose time has come in this opposite direction. We've seen history go back and forth, and this is like the seventh or eighth inning in the game. It's getting kind of late, and but we still think we can have some success.
Yeah, I think that, both paths are important for achieving liberty, because it's like you can persuade or you can evade. Evading is also important because you can persuade people to about the ideas of liberty, or those people who cannot be persuaded, you can just somehow get away from them, and that can be like declaring independence, like the Americans did. It can be asserting independence, also like the Americans did, but not necessarily through conflict, not necessarily through physical violence. That you can do things like civil disobedience, like you know doing things like Bitcoin, where it just makes it a lot harder for the statist ideology of people who would like to crack down on your freedoms to actually do that. And then once you've carved out that space, then the example, uh, that if good things blossom from that, then the example becomes an argument in itself. It's like, oh, what are they doing? Like maybe we should try doing that. Maybe their ideas about liberty are not so bad.
Yeah, something that can be replicated. Yeah.
But I think persuading is indispensable also, because if there was no persuasion, then there would be no you know people to exchange Bitcoin with. There would be no people to create like free societies with. And the more that you can persuade, the less that the easier it will be to evade the remainder of people who won't leave you alone. So yeah, I think that both are key.
Yeah. Well, and the example you did of the founding fathers when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was a wonderful document in another way because it was a transparent or honest statement of what their goals were. In other words, they publicly declared what their intentions were, and in so doing, um, uh, showed their sincerity and their, in a sense, goodness, if you will, to anybody who would care to read what they had to say. So I would apply that in my libertarian thinking. In other words, the libertarian, at least of the type that I subscribe to, is not trying to proactively interfere or harm other people who have different cultural or political ideas. It's as I see it, the libertarian can transparently claim that they are seeking freedom for themselves because that's important to them. I don't personally believe in the idea of imposing freedom on people who don't want to be free. So if I don't see my job as looking out and seeing two people and out there in the world and saying, "Oh, you don't have a libertarian relationship between the two of you." I'm here to fix that. I don't see that as my problem. My problem is the relationship between myself and society. And of course, anybody who thinks like me, then they see that as a relationship between themselves and society. Now we have a group of people who see that. Now we're more than one person who wants to alter the relationship between ourselves and society. But that doesn't necessarily include the alteration or abolishment of society. I think libertarians have believed that it doesn't that it necessarily does entail that, which is something I think we'll cover, eventually. I think a way can be found to start to do liberty that just leaves the legacy, historical society intact, lets grandma continue to collect her Social Security checks, lets my nationalist friends continue to have a defense budget, lets all the different levels of welfare state society continue to have their cash flows, et cetera, while we start our society. And a lot, it's funny that you talked about the Declaration of Independence, because that's the one sheet of paper I have in front of me with some highlighted. I'm not kidding, too. It's the one thing that I picked out that I should have with me. So you'll remember this sentence: "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed." So I'm almost in tears here because this document is so beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm going to lose it here. But the sentiment is so important because we're saying we're patient. We're not happy with the way things are going. We feel oppressed, but we're going to be patient, and we're going to try to work within the parameters of what everybody else is doing. We're going to try to be ethical, nonviolent, transparent, honest, and listen and talk. But at the same time, we do have some legitimate grievances, and we want to start to address those in our lifetime. We're not going to. We're not talking about 200 or 300 years from now when things have all, collapsed and rise from the ashes. We're talking about now. So again, that document, of course, whenever any form of government becomes destructive, those ends, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's so many beautiful passages. And the founding fathers were philosophers in their own right, very, very learned, and reached just a high degree of political awareness. What they knew that people don't know today is they knew the tendencies once certain things got established. They knew where that led. We don't do that anymore today. We just enact all these things, and we're not conscious of where that, well, some of us may be, but as a society, and even let's say all the people in the universities, et cetera, they never consider where the whole tendency of adding all law after law after law with no revision, with no release on the other end, where that will go. And they seem unconcerned about it. So it's just not part of their concern. They're only concerned with the next restriction, and they're not concerned with the consequences of that. And they're not concerned with any liberations. They're not concerned with any lifting restrictions. So again, this is just to say that that's the atmosphere that we're in, that our challenge, the ideas that we're trying to bring to the fore are within this atmosphere that's very challenging. I don't think it's impossible, but it's a challenging environment. I probably can get agreement on that.
Definitely. I think that, earlier you mentioned flaws in the Declaration of Independence that might have become its own undoing. There's definitely flaws like that in the Constitution. So I think that's part of it, but a big part of it too is just a failure of education because ultimately even the good parts of the Constitution have been misinterpreted and twisted to serve statist ends because statism was the prevailing ideology. And and so it, documents just become a dead letter as soon as the spirit in which they were drafted no longer resides in the hearts of the people who live under those documents. And so the founding generation, they really understood liberty. They understood Locke's philosophy and how it applies to humans living among each other. But I think progressively, every generation that was just not transmitted as well. There is ideally there would have been progress where the founding generation and their children had improved on the Lockean ideas that animated the Declaration of Independence. And then the next generation had even better ideas, but it went in the other direction. And so the prevailing ideology, like, people just didn't understand those ideas anymore. It's not that they refuted them. Like, nobody refuted Locke, um, and Smith later. It just got supplanted, and just people just fell for worse ideas, and so now we're in a place where we still have this beautiful Declaration of Independence, that is so philosophically sound, and a constitution that was originally an attempt to implement those ideas in the Declaration, but the people don't understand it because society has been so dumbed down that they may like have heard the words, but they don't understand what they mean. And so, that's ultimately the problem, is that the ideology wasn't preserved or improved upon. Um it was like progressively lost throughout across the generations.
Well, if as I see, it's a logical progression because the very first the first school that was government run or founded by a government can no longer argue against um, government provided education. A government provided school cannot have a curriculum that argues against its own existence, and so it won't. So that they'll teach. You can start off with good intentions, say we'll teach these 10 things, but the one thing it can't teach is that it shouldn't exist. So it has
Right.
to omit anything that would be question its own existence as a public education, government education. And if you expand that, then you have a second college or elementary school that can't teach that it shouldn't exist. And then if you expand that throughout society, and then you do that for 2 centuries, you have a society, because it's not then if government should be taking over education. Well, isn't healthcare more important than education? I mean, my I need a surgery. I have a heart attack. I need kidney disease. So then how can you argue against public provided healthcare? And then and it just goes on from there. And so you make a great point, and I would say it's almost a little more scary than people don't understand the Constitution. I think we're at a precarious point where the public, a large part of the public, believes that the Constitution is standing between them and the society that they want. So when we went through free speech, the way it was told from the other side, who were the people who were trying to censor, was that it felt to them like the Constitution was a document which was really stopping good things from happening, which is regulating speech and stopping hate speech, what they call hate speech or disinformation, which essentially is the opposite political philosophy is what they're trying to do. So I don't see I guess I don't see it as a moral failing of our society to uphold the values of libertarianism or liberty as the government grew. I I see it as a failing to not know that if you started to introduce government functions to provide goods and services, that you were going to have a hard time drawing. It was a slippery slope that you were just going to have to keep going with that. So whenever you start that, no matter who you are, if you're Thomas Jefferson, if you're George Washington, and you start that process, currency, and you start that process, I don't know how you stop it. And I think history shows that it can't be stopped because um, the the idea is, and I use that when I write, just the idea of importance. In other words, what's important? So look, in the last 30 years of our political existence, what's important? Global warming is very important. Healthcare is very important. Race relations or equality are very important. So we have a government which its job is to. We already know that the government, we use that to provide certain outcomes. So it's only natural, and we've already gotten so far with education, with insurance, with banking. Everything's heavily regulated. So all that needs to happen is if I can convince the public that there's something important, then it's just a logical necessity, inevitability that the public has to say, well, let's get that over the government side. We shouldn't let people be driving their cars as much as they want when there's global warming is super important. We shouldn't let people say whatever they want when there's sensitive race relations. We shouldn't, we shouldn't allow these freedoms to happen when there's so many important things, and we've already proven and shown that government can handle these things. So I tend not to see it as a moral failing, unless someone wanted to make the case that allowing it in the first place was a moral failing. I see it more of as an inevitability that if we accept certain principles, we have nothing to stand on when the next person comes up and wants to utilize those principles for reasons now that we disagree with. We say, well, I just wanted to do it for the thing I wanted. I wanted the government to be established I want a government court system so that, when somebody invades, tramples on my rights, I have a place to go, and I want a government to protect me from foreign invaders. And inadvertently now I've started a process, and the next person's going to come up to me and go, well, Adam, well, you agreed for these three things, and I have something you can't deny that this is important. And if you will deny it, I will go to the public and I will convince them that it's important. Now, could have history gone differently? Could other leaders or could other people have done something to maybe stop that? Well, yes, possibly they could have. But it's very easy to see how naturally that just happened. And we're still in that. We're in the seventh inning of that. We just went through an attempt to censor speech. We just went through an attempt to abolish medical freedom. So we're still in that process of transferring things from private control to government control. And as we're talking about today, looking for ideas to get us out of that predicament at least for those who want to get out. Again, I personally, if somebody wants to live in a welfare state and accept the consequences of that, I personally have no objection. Of course, that's not maybe not a widely held view in libertarianism, but maybe it's quirky on my part. But anyway,
Yeah, I think that an example of the sort of this um, fatal flaw or this one exception that just proliferates and just destroys the entire system is that Thomas Jefferson, especially, but many other founders really believed that education was a function of government, was an important function of government. And I think part of that was that they believed in democracy and they wanted the people to be in power, but in order for the people to be wise with power, that they needed to be enlightened. And so that was something that needed to be subsidized to make sure that the people were enlightened, so that, you know, as under popular sovereignty, that we wouldn't lose liberty. But that presumes that government schools will breed enlightenment, and obviously that hasn't been the case. That schools have dumbed down the populace, that schools have utterly failed to they've progressively failed generation across generation, just getting worse and worse, um, to the point where just basic basic skills they can't even impart, let alone, lofty philosophies and understanding of the nature of government and of freedom. And but it's not only incompetence, it's institutionally incentivized, um, that the institutions are all misaligned, because it's like the saying, like, when you send your kids to the emperor to be educated, don't be surprised when they come back as Romans. It's like, if government, you know, government is institutionally incentivized to perpetuate itself and to expand. And so if
well,
you
as we just demonstrated 5 minutes ago, if you send your kid to a public school, don't expect them to come back and say that the government has no business providing education. That's the one
exactly
thing they won't come back and say. They can't be taught that, because the school can't argue against its own existence.
right
But when you're
right
saying the founding fathers were in charge of, were in favor of public education, as much as I love them and as much as I think they were heroes, um, there's a word for that. It's called social engineering. Regardless of if somebody has wonderful intentions and they're just really good people, and no matter what our debt to them is, if they do and if they engage in an activity, um, I as a human being, as somebody who wants to be, who values honesty and transparency, we just have to call it what it is. No, they're not claiming to be perfect, and we don't have to claim that they were perfect. We just have to claim that they were very good. So to me, if Thomas Jefferson is a very good individual, when I say that, I mean in the political sense of what he did for, our political existence. It doesn't mean that I therefore have to not recognize when I see something that I know in any other context that I would say that's social engineering. In other words, and then that gets back to, and you can see the logic. If I say, well, I'm going to use public education to make sure that all the kids value democracy. Well, the next person's going to come along and go, well, Adam, you've agreed that schools should be used for this important thing. I have something that's important. You will agree that this other thing's important. So the schools should be used for this next important thing. Now you've just set it right up. Now, of course, I'm not trying to argue that everybody has to be perfect and nobody can do anything because everything they do implies other things, because that's probably true. But you can see that um, there's just a logical progression once you start into motion a principle, and you're powerless to stop it once you have initiated it yourself or been a major player in that or agreed to it. You know, that's why it's like you know uh, in my personal life, I'm hesitant to share music because if I share my music, then I have to accept another person sharing their music with me, and I have to decide, do I really want to do that? So I've had times in my life where I really wanted to send somebody this album, musical album that meant so much to me. And what stopped me from doing it is, well, if I want to be fair about this and reciprocal, the other person is just as valid as human being as me. And therefore, I need to be prepared to accept an album from them in return. But I'm so particular in my musical taste, I actually don't want to receive that album in return. So that limits me. Then the principle that I put into, in general, I'm sure I've sent an album to somebody, but in general, I won't do it, even though I badly want to. So once you start a principle, you demonstrate that you become powerless to stop it because you've already agreed to that principle. And so again, our founding fathers weren't perfect. I'm sure the other side of the aisle wants to go into all their moral imperfections and all that with regard to race relations or imperialism. But when I say they weren't perfect, I mean with respect to what I wanted from them, which was a libertarian society or a free society. And they were not perfect in that respect. They were just very good. There's no shame in that. So when you start public provision of services and goods, you enter something, and then the next person can say, well, what about this thing over here? Shouldn't that be publicly provided? Well, there's smart people at Harvard. There's smart people at the New York Times. They're going to make those arguments, and they're probably going to convince the public that if Adam has agreed to accept it here, then Bill should get his thing entered into as well.
Yeah, you have to wonder, like, what if the founding generation had just completely homeschooled? Um, maybe they did. I'm not sure if they. I mean, they believed in public education, but I don't know if it
Yeah, and you
was
know
instituted that fast.
the anecdotal evidence on homeschool kids. How they excel. I mean, the statistics on that are pretty amazing. And what you get
Yeah,
out of go ahead.
just in terms of like what I was talking about earlier of transmitting values
Hmm.
from generation to generation. The best way to do that is through the family, is through mothers and fathers inculcating their children. And once you have like an intermediary, especially when that intermediary is a bureaucrat, well, they're going to try to transmit their own values. And if they're a bureaucrat, then they're going to tend to be like pro big government values.
No question. And morality aside, just morality aside, is totally normal. I mean, in other words, if the whole purpose from taking money from me and giving it and through non-voluntary means was so that I don't get to do with it what I want. So if somebody takes it and does something that I don't want, what did I expect? I mean, that was the purpose of taking that in the first place. Um, but yeah, with education, you public education, they can't argue against that. That bureaucrat can't argue against his own source of his own livelihood. It would be the very, it's not technically impossible. I mean, I'm sure somebody could point to an example of somebody who is publicly funded who says, I shouldn't be here and you shouldn't allow public education. There's probably some 2 or 3 people who said that in the last 100 years. But I think everybody would understand our point that by and large, you're not going to argue for your own impoverishment. So that's where we are today. In other words, public education is a fact, and the citizens are being educated in the theory of public provision of goods and services. That's the theories they're being taught. So that again, that gets back to our challenge as libertarians. It goes to one more of what I call the initial conditions. In other words, if we're going to try to have liberty be a real thing for at least some people, there's certain conditions that we're going to face that we need to be totally eyes open to, and not think that things are somehow different than they are. We can't be fooling ourselves as to the real situation, which is we're living in a time where um, um, we are a minority, a very small minority, um, in a historical time when most of our fellow citizens have been educated in a government perspective of society, and that's just a fact. So then, that has to be factored into our strategy. We just has to be, you know, this has something that we know. And when our strategy has to already have accounted for that, say, okay, well, yeah, we know that, we know this, we know this. Okay, so this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, and it can feel daunting when you think about how outnumbered we are, but less so if you consider what Leonard Reed would always stress is that there's no social movement for good or for evil that wasn't led by an infinitesimal minority. That, that with the founding generation, that was the case. With Bolsheviks, that was the case. And so, even though libertarians, we are an infinitesimal minority, if we become the best infinitesimal minority, like if we become the most dedicated to self-improvement, the most dedicated to learning, the most dedicated to sharing our learning and becoming ever better at writing and speaking and becoming ever more moral and becoming ever more innovative and the kinds of ideas that you're developing in terms of translating these liberty ideas into real life liberty, then then we will be the infinitesimal minority that leads. And and
I think you could summarize what you're saying. What you just said is, I would just translate very simply as, if we have the best ideas, and a- and it's not as daunting as it might seem, because the other ideas are so atrocious. So in a sense, the challenge is really just, what can we come up with good ideas? Because in other ideas, it's just more laws. It's just more laws and more law enforcement. There is no other ideas there. We already know what's going to happen tomorrow. Something important is going to happen. They're going to argue that something important that needs more regulation. That's the idea. So, but what we don't have is an animating idea that seems to be better. I mean, or I would argue, I should say, I would argue that what's preventing us is just the fact that maybe we haven't developed the the better ideas, um, and that's why we're kind of at a standstill.
yeah, I mean, it depends on how you defined how you define have in that sentence. Have the best ideas, because some people might say, oh well, we already have the best ideas. And so it's just a matter of, propagandizing them, like propagating them better. But Leonard Reed would argue that, like, a lot of us think we have the best ideas, but don't actually have them. Like, to really have an idea is to understand it well enough that you can explain it to others. That's the only meaningful way of saying that you have a better idea. And so, like, if you only have like a very superficial understanding of liberty and you can't even explain it to someone, then you don't really have the better ideas, the best ideas. You affiliate with a tradition in which some people do, and a lot of people in the past have, but you don't have them yourself. And I think if this infinitesimal minority that we're part of actually had these ideas much better than they do now, such that they could, Leonard Reed will always say, like, you have to be able to make the case for liberty as easily as saying that, explaining that 2 + 2 is 4. Like, if 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 this core, um, of the liberty movement actually had that capacity, then I think it would just be a totally different ballgame. So that's why I don't think it's just a matter of, like, okay, well, we've tried the ideas route, and that's not working, because I don't think we really have tried the ideas route.
Hmm.
Like we've had some great books, um, and we've had great authors of books, but, like, right now, this generation hasn't really absorbed the ideas in those books to the point where they've made it their own, to the point where they do understand it so well that they could relate it uh, to someone else, because that's the standard of whether you really understand an idea, is if you can articulate it, persuasively to another person.
Well, that's, this is a, kind of, we're getting kind of a little to the nub of kind of where we are, libertarians are intellectually. And the challenge, I think, of what you're expressing is that um, it implies that maybe that there is a singular um, liberty idea that people haven't learned well enough, which, okay, that's possible. But when I've talked to people, when I go out, I joked previously that every libertarian is a philosopher king. And when you discuss with other libertarians, it turns out that there's lots of disagreement on what, there's all the different schools of libertarianism. And there's a lot of disagreement on what liberty is or what the vision would be. And then, of course, there's going to be lots of disagreement on implementation. So that I'm wondering if it's not a competition. In other words, if we're not all in competition, each school or each individual, however you want to say it, because we're not in agreement, even amongst ourselves, what liberty is and how it works. And the test of in my mind, the test of the best idea may not be the idea that I convince my fellow libertarian to do. It may be the one that is able to be acted upon. In other words, the one that has success in the quote unquote real world. Going back, I guess, analogous to Imagine before Bitcoin was introduced, they just had lots of seminars on a future cryptocurrency, and they were all arguing why it hasn't happened. And you're saying, well, we have this great idea. The cypherpunks have this great idea. It's a vision of a non-state currency. but they're all arguing amongst themselves how to do it. But the test, each one, for example, I know the history of cryptocurrency, that certain people tried to launch them and they failed. So to me, in that sense, again, taking morality out of it, we could say that was a bad idea in just the practical fact of its failing, because some of the ones that were launched earlier were centralized, so they could be shut down easily. So the best idea turned out to be, as I would argue, the one that was launched that wasn't shut down, that actually survived. That was the best idea. So I see libertarianism, maybe I could argue that I'm not sure that if you and I go out to our libertarian public, that we will find a lot of agreement. I think we'll find different clans. We'll find different important, very persuasive figures and their followers, little 5 or 6 figures. The really good ones will have 20 followers. The smaller guys will have 3 or 4 followers. And then there will be some around the clusters of certain universities, certain think tanks. And I don't think Cato libertarianism is the same as my libertarianism, and may not be the same as your libertarianism or George Mason libertarianism. But if somebody's a hop mon or a mon hop, to me that's a certain school of libertarianism, and I don't know how much agreement we have on what liberty really is. So I almost see that we are competing. And I just, mean that in just the almost broad sense, just like the marketplace of ideas. But I don't think it's going to be, that competition is going to be won by persuasion. I think we'll all go to the grave with our own libertarian philosophers, and that libertarian philosophy would only improve one funeral at a time, and that the test of a good idea in libertarianism strategy would be the one that succeeds, the one that has some success in the field eventually. So in other words, that's how I will plan to judge it. So if somebody, in Maine right now has some idea and they start to do something, it's like, darn, they start to somehow eke out and start some process that somehow creates political liberty in a way that I can see and say, wow, I didn't think of that. I hadn't thought of that idea, what they've just done. And they start to somehow get people participating and the thing starts to grow. That would be a good idea. So I take it more in a practical sense.
Well, the way I don't think that there's a conflict between pragmatism or practicality and theoretical principle. That what makes a theoretical principle sound is if it maps with the reality it's describing. And if it maps with the reality of it's describing, then action taken according to it will tend to succeed in reality. And so I think you can find what works through theory. You can also stumble into proper theory by trying things based on what works. So like, for example, one that you're very familiar with is that praxeology. That praxeology and economics, which is a branch of praxeology, that it's not derived empirically. Like we don't, like, economists didn't try different economic reforms and then said, like, oh, okay, well, that worked, so I guess we have the theory of supply and demand. Rather, the sound theory of supply and demand is derived from understanding preference rankings. And understanding preference rankings comes from understanding the category of action. And that action undertaken according to that works. That if you understand the law of supply and demand, and because of that you don't try to price fix, then you'll have markets clearing, and you won't have shortages, and you won't have surpluses. And so I think it's the same way with the theory of liberty, that humans have a nature, and understanding human nature can help you understand what moral codes accord with human nature and which ones don't.
Mhm.
And you'll find that that if actions that follow the ones that do will tend to have success. And again, you can stumble into the correct philosophy by saying, like, okay, well, you know that didn't work. um but it just it means that you didn't do your philosophizing correctly.
Mhm.
Like in the same way that if some society that didn't understand the law of supply and demand, if they had an economic theory that endorsed price fixing, and then they say, oh man, our it's not working, we keep having these shortages and surpluses, like maybe we got something wrong, and then they have to go back to the drawing board and work it out. But it's the drawing board reasoning that the understanding is actually based on.
I think maybe that we could summarize this by saying that y- you know you and I might agree that liberty isn't our liberties aren't expanding the way we would prefer. So we would like the next few years for us to have more freedoms, and that's not happening. And we don't see the great prospects for that happening. Let's say in the next 2 years. So one way is to say, well, we have our libertarian theories we've been devising for the last 50 years. People just aren't assimilating them enough, and that's why uh, we're not seeing more liberty. But somebody else could say, well, no, it's actually people have assimilated those ideas, but the theory is not correct, and that's why. So they're both valid propositions. Valid meaning we're verbalizing two possibilities that are plausibly possible, and I come from the school of thought that says that libertarianism or liberty hasn't been conceived in a way which will allow it to become an effective force. So, in my thinking about it is that we need some tweaking of how we kind of envision liberty or libertarianism for it to succeed. And whereas I think there's also a plausible argument that says, well, we have very 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 capable theoretical works, and we just haven't got enough people or the right people to really understand them and to take them seriously. And when that happens, that will or could lead to the future that we want. I don't think each libertarian would describe it differently what that future is. I don't think there's 100% agreement on it, but very broadly we can always say almost every libertarian supports a market-based society, because the market is individuals making choices to buy and sell voluntarily. So almost every libertarian agrees that the expansion of the market system. And I think by and large, I could get most libertarians to agree that we want greater individual autonomy, that we don't want more and more a mounting series of restrictions so that our autonomy keeps shrinking. some people might want it just to stay where it was in 1950 or something, or they may want it to stay where it was in 1980. But we definitely don't want it to be shrinking. So by those standards, what we're trying to achieve is not being achieved. So the question is why? Why is that? Why haven't we been successful in that sense? And I think we're trying to touch on some of those reasons. Um, you know, why aren't we succeeding fully? Uh, we're making some good ideas. We're making some good theories. We're making some friends. Our pets' heads are falling off. But why? That's hopefully everybody gets that reference. Um, so it's really fascinating. I think it's a fascinating topic, and um, I could obviously talk about it for hours. I'm not sure how much longer we want to talk about it, but do you have any takes, or are there any other things that we want to talk about?
No, I think we cover some great ground.
Okay. Again, to recap, we were talking about um, eh, ideas and how they can influence society. One of the most inspiring ones was our Declaration of Independence, most inspiring political document to most libertarians or many libertarians. And then there was the Communist Manifesto, which served as the founding document of the other side of the aisle. And historically, in the last 100 years, we've been going in a certain direction: the New Deal, Great Society, um, and with more and more with government growing. And the challenge of libertarians is to try to see if they can um, take libertarianism a little bit out of the realm of only scholarship, and see if we can start to enlarge the realm of individual autonomy in our lifetime, to try to see if we can start that going. So we're going to keep talking about these kinds of ideas and see what headway we can make in persuading people, and maybe even taking some actions one day towards that goal. So that's all I have, Dan. If you don't have anything else, we can say goodbye to our viewers and close it down.
I really had a lot of fun with this conversation. So thank you, Adam.
Me too. Thank you, Dan.